Fidel Castro. For some people, this name evokes irritation. For others, admiration. For someone, the commander was a ruthless dictator and a communist tyrant. For someone, a fighter for freedom. Let's not look at all these boring planes from Wikipedia and textbooks, but at really surprising and little-known dramatic facts related to this historical figure. Let's go, and let's start perhaps with this. Yes. In the essay Personal Portrait of Fidel, Gabriel Garcia Marquez, a close friend of Castro, was the first to reveal his incredible passion for ice cream. Having lunch at the Havana Libre Hotel, he could eat 18 scoops of ice cream for dessert. In this same hotel, by the way, one of the assassination attempts on Castro took place in 1963. CIA agents had prepared one of the kitchen workers to sprinkle poison in the ice cream or milkshake. The worker messed up, accidentally breaking the capsule when he was removing it from the freezer wall where it was hidden. CIA General Fabian Escalante in retirement said that this was their closest attempt to assassinate Fidel, and there were quite a few of them. It is officially considered that there were 638 assassination attempts, though the unsuccessful attempt is not counted in history, especially since Castro himself gave the legendary director Oliver Stone a different number, 734. But even if we consider it approximate, we are still talking about hundreds of attempts to eliminate the stubborn Fidel. Poison tablets, toxic cigars, hens, exploding mollusks, a wetsuit with toxins, and much more. If the ability to survive after attempts on my life were an Olympic discipline, I would have a gold medal in it, said the commander. For the United States of America, removing Castro became an obsession. Everything else is less important, not worth regretting money, time, human resources, and efforts, was said in one of the White House records. What did he annoy them with? Let's discuss the ice cream now and return to the other topic later. Coming to power, Castro announced that one of his main tasks as the head of Cuba is to develop a thriving dairy industry. To start, they decided to build the largest ice cream palace in Havana, a grandiose structure for 1,000 people. They named it Coppelia in honor of Castro's favorite ballet. The attendants in the establishment were dressed as ballerinas, with crossed legs from ballet shoes adorning the palace's emblem. In Coppelia, you could try 50 types of ice cream, and many actually admitted that it was the best in the world. But for ice cream, you needed milk. But in the early years of Castro's rule in Cuba, there were incredible problems with it. The island almost didn't produce it. Milk was delivered from East Germany, and condensed milk from the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. The thing was that there were many cows in Cuba, but they belonged to two breeds that give little milk: Creoles, brought by the Spaniards, and Zebu, brought from India. Both feel great in a tropical climate, but you can't build a dairy empire on them. So Fidel decided to bring the most productive cows in the world, Holsteins, to the island, ordering them from Canada. But the newcomers wouldn't live in the tropics. Nearly all of the third party perished instantly. The survivors were rescued by setting up air-conditioned stalls. Then Fidel issued two decrees. Firstly, Cuba will breed its own breed of tropical dairy cows, creating a hybrid with local zebu. Secondly, killing a cow is equated to killing a person, so one can get up to 15 years for it. The experiment to crossbreed was not very successful. Tropical Holsteins often turned out to be infertile. The genetic differences between the breeds were too great, and they produced slightly more milk than zebu. But one of the specimens from Castro's cowshed turned out to be a real champion. A cow named Ubre Blanca set a world record for milk yield. In a day, this beauty produced up to 100 liters of milk, so she surpassed the previous champion, an American cow nicknamed Orly. Ubre Blanca was a personal pride of Castro. The cow was kept in a comfortable shed with air conditioning, armed security, and scientists on duty. When the cow died, they wrote an obituary worthy of the country's first lady and erected a monument in Havana. And her DNA and egg cells were preserved for future cloning. Disappointed with the idea of simple crossbreeding, Castro decided to create a breed of miniature cows the size of a dog. In theory, such a cow was supposed to live in the house, and even in the apartment of every Cuban, daily delighting him with fresh milk. The feeding problem was proposed to be solved simply by installing grow boxes in homes, which would grow grass for the mini cows. But the project, quite obviously, was not implemented for many reasons, but certainly not due to lack of time. After all, this slightly quirky milk story makes the fact that the father of the Cuban Revolution ruled Cuba from 1959 to 2006, a total of 47 years, even more contrasting. This is the third longest reign in the world. Only Queen Elizabeth and the King of Thailand have surpassed him. During this same period, the United States, Cuba's main ideological adversary, had 11 presidents. Despite the modest size of the state of Cuba itself, no one dares to call Fidel Castro a small Latin American dictator. The scale of this man's personality is too great, and he has too many outstanding qualities. For example, it is known that Fidel Castro had an exceptional memory. At the age of 80, he could recite any speech without notes. He is also the author of the longest speech in history at the United Nations on September 26, 1960. At the General Assembly, he spoke non-stop for 4 hours and 29 minutes. And Castro's longest speech at home was delivered at the Third Congress of the Cuban Communist Party in 1986. It lasted 7 hours and 10 minutes at the Cuban Communist Party. In 1986, it lasted 7 hours and 10 minutes. To better understand what drove this man, let's go back to the beginning. Fidel Alejandro Castro Ruz was born on August 13, 1926, into a family of landowners and planters who had emigrated to Cuba from Spain. Biographers of Fidel often draw parallels with Vladimir Lenin. Both came from well-off middle-class families. Both initially pursued law, then led revolutions and went on to govern states. However, compared to Lenin, who by the time of the revolution in 1917 already had some political experience, Castro took a more rebellious and adventurous path to victory. Just consider the fact that in 1933, at the age of 13, young Fidel participated in a workers' revolt on his own father's plantation. Agree, it's a stark contrast to today, where 13-year-olds are at most contemplating a career as a blogger or an esports player. But those times were completely different. For the first half of the 20th century, Cuba was in complete financial dependence on the United States of America. The 30s saw a particularly severe crisis, which allowed a group of military activists led by Fulgencio Batista to stage a coup. Batista's policy, oriented towards rapprochement with the United States, did not at all coincide with what young Castro wanted to see Cuba as. And at that moment, Fidel Castro intended to raise a rebellion as a nationalist, not as a communist. Then he founded the movement Generación del Centenario, or the Century Generation, and its main goal became the overthrow of Batista. On the 26th of July, 1953, 165 men led by Castro attacked the barracks. The aim of the attack was the weapons needed to overthrow Batista. But in the battle, some of the enthusiasts died, and the rest, predictably with Fidel, ended up in the hands of the government. The population did not side with Castro and his followers, and they were all arrested and convicted. On the day of the verdict, the young 27-year-old lawyer Fidel Castro uttered words that were later, as they say, carved in granite. "I am concluding my defense speech, but I will not act as all lawyers do, who ask for freedom for the defendant. I cannot ask for it when my comrades are already suffering. The Isle of Pines in shameful confinement. Send me to them to share their fate. It's clear that in such a republic, where the president is a criminal thief, the honest must either die or sit in jail. I know that prison will be a hard trial for me, like it has never been for anyone else. It is full of threats for me, of low and cowardly cruelty. But I am not afraid of prison, just as I am not afraid of the fury of a tyrant who took the lives of my 70 brothers. Condemn me. It does not matter. History will absolve me." The last phrase eventually entered history as Fidel's main motto in life. Then the movement's leader was sentenced to 15 years in prison, but he was not destined to serve the entire term. He was released on amnesty in May 1955, just 19 months later. Then the future leader of the Cuban Revolution went to Mexico, where he met another historical figure, Che Guevara. and this meeting greatly influenced his future views. Why did Fidel go there specifically? There were several reasons for this. Mexico, after its revolution from 1910 to 1917, had a reputation as one of the most democratic in Latin America. Moreover, its leadership traditionally provided refuge to people who were persecuted for political reasons. Also, Mexico was the first Latin American country to recognize the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics in 1924. A large flow of political immigrants rushed to Mexico after the overthrow, not without the help of the CIA, of the progressive government of Jacobo Arbenz in Guatemala in 1954. Cubans also went there. Having this information, Fidel quite reasonably assumed that he could assemble a strike force with minimal losses to overthrow Batista. And he was right. People from all sides came to Fidel in Mexico, ready to join his movement. Soon he met Che. At that moment, Ernesto Guevara, the real name of the future symbol of the revolution, was 28 years old. 4 years before that, as a medical student, Guevara, along with his friend Alberto Granado, embarked on a motorcycle journey across Latin America. He was shocked by what he saw on this journey. The widespread poverty, hunger, and injustice in the continent ignited a strong internal protest within him. Thus began his transformation into a fighter and revolutionary. In Mexico, Guevara ended up there not by chance. He witnessed the counter-revolutionary coup in Guatemala in 1954, and he too had to flee. Initially, Che was appointed as a doctor of the future expedition, but later he was enlisted in the composition of the fighters and, together with others, had to go through a full course of combat training. At that moment, the expedition lacked a ship, weapons, and soldiers. Having gathered new forces in November of 1956, Castro arrived in Cuba in the company of Che Guevara, his brother Raul, and 79 armed supporters. The pleasure yacht Grandma became one of the symbols of the uprising, but this event was nothing like a sea stroll. A large part of the rebels were killed immediately upon encountering the government forces. Only a dozen revolutionaries managed to escape and hide in the mountains. The Cuban peasants generally welcomed Castro's squad members and housed them in their homes. In addition, many local residents joined the revolutionaries, becoming part of the insurgent armed formation. So, just a couple of years later, on January 2nd, 1959, the rebel army entered Havana. Batista was forced to flee the country, and hundreds of his supporters were executed after trials. Why did Castro's victory on a small patch of earth in the middle of the ocean mean so much to the global community? But by the 50s, the enthusiasm of socialists and communists had somehow faded. The world revolution that the first Soviet leaders dreamed of somehow did not happen. After the cult of Stalin's personality was condemned, the world communist camp split. And then Cuba flared up. Without any help from the Soviet Union, a real revolution arose and won. All this gave a huge impulse to the slowly fading socialist camp. Cuba instantly became a symbol of the victory of the socialist revolution and a thorn in the eye of the United States of America and the rest of the capitalist world. How did it happen that three young guys, who had no support from outside, managed to make the whole world talk about them? How did they manage this without the U.S. noticing? Nikolai Leonov, a prominent Soviet intelligence officer and close friend of Fidel and Raul Castro, shares insights from those involved. The Castro brothers and Che Guevara had a deep belief in the necessity of social justice. They believed that their calling was not personal, but only of a national character. Perhaps this is the cornerstone of the world view of the Castro brothers and Che Guevara. They strive to change their society, state, and people for the better. At the same time, they were all well-off people, and they had no personal goal to get rich. According to Leonov, who was personally acquainted with all three, these were highly educated people. The leaders of the future revolution were torn for some time between building a socialist society or perfecting the capitalist one. They knew Marx and the economists well before the Marxist period. But later, they decided that under the conditions of Cuba, the paths of socialist transformations are necessary. Their main goal was to achieve full independence of Cuba from the United States of America, and they went straight to their goal. In general, Che Guevara's story is a separate big one which we will gladly cover in the next issue. If you want this, just let us know with a like and a comment that a video about him would be interesting for you, and we will put it into work. Well, let's continue now. So, the Cuban Revolution took place, and systematic work began to solve the problems posed by its leaders. In 1960, Fidel Castro nationalized businesses and companies owned by Americans. In response, Washington imposed a trade embargo on Cuba, which isolated Cuba from the rest of the world for many decades. It was then that the so-called Cuban Missile Crisis erupted, turning Cuba into a battlefield of the Cold War between the United States of America and the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. The unsuccessful attempt to overthrow Castro in 1961 and the discovery of Soviet nuclear missiles on Cuban territory by American intelligence brought the world to the brink of nuclear war. In the end, Nikita Khrushchev was the first to remove missiles from Cuba in exchange for a secret removal of American weapons from Turkey. The crisis was averted. For many years, a stream of money flowed from the Soviet Union to Cuba, as if from a cornucopia. The elder brother supported Cuba, buying a large part of the sugarcane grown on the island. Also, Soviet ships would dock in the port of Havana with goods to aid Cubans, who were enduring a harsh American embargo. All this went on for many years. During this time, Fidel Castro abolished legal discrimination, brought electricity to rural areas, and ensured full employment of the population. He actively built new schools and hospitals, contributing significantly to the development of education and healthcare. Medicine in Cuba was completely free, and Cuba's child mortality rates were even high compared to developed countries. But there was a downside. Castro limited the amount of land a person could own and abolished private business. But it all ended with the collapse of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. The still active American embargo and the absence of aid from the Soviet Union led to an endless deficit of practically everything. And although in 2014, Russia wrote off $31.7 billion of Cuban debt, it didn't get much easier from this.
Because we were left absolutely alone in close proximity to the most powerful state, which has never existed in history before. And all those events stimulated the horror of the blockade, which had already lasted more than 30 years by that time. A period has come that we call special, a special period in peacetime. We studied all possible measures to withstand the blockade in wartime, but we never imagined that we would have a blockade in peacetime. When I talk about the collapse of the Union to Cubans, I'm not talking about the collapse of the socialist camp. It's like saying that the sun won't rise tomorrow. Everyone believes that the sun will rise tomorrow. We thought the same about the Soviet Union, but one day it happened, and the sun did not rise. The Soviet Union disappeared, and there were two superpowers before, the Soviet Union and the United States of America. We remained alone in front of a superpower with tremendous technology, economic, political, and military power, which continued to grow. And for more than 30 years, I tried to end the Cuban Revolution. I can assure you that we always gratefully remember what the Russian people have done for us, both in the early years and in the subsequent years. We had to endure the United States blockade for a long time. I have discussed this with my comrades on many occasions. In the early years, we were ready to perish. It becomes bitter when you remember, but there are no feelings of resentment. Those were hard days, but they did not breed resentment. Tens of thousands of Cubans speak Russian. Tens of thousands of them studied at your universities. We even made mistakes. I should have spoken out with criticism. There appeared a tendency to neglect the English language. Everyone was studying Russian. It was natural I spoke publicly. Russia translates its books into English first and foremost. Impressive literature into English. Russians learn English. Chinese people learn English, and we only Russian.
In our days in Cuba, they are unwinding a lot of ideological hoops. For example, 5 years ago, the Cuban authorities announced the legalization of small and medium-sized private businesses. And from the 1st of January this year, they are conducting a monetary reform. So the rise in prices, devaluation, are the current realities of modern Cuba. For example, heated discussions in Cuban society have caused a serious increase in electricity prices. After all, as part of the reform, the government will stop subsidizing a number of enterprises that provide services to the population. In turn, the authorities have also issued several decrees on increasing wages in the public sector and pensions. The plan aims to increase wages and pensions to offset the elimination of broad subsidies for all citizens. For instance, this includes discontinuing the ration system, which provided thousands of Cubans with food products at extremely low prices. Today, despite all the difficulties, Cuba is a state with a high level of literacy, freely sending its doctors and teachers to third-world countries. For example, the Cuban program Operation Miracle represents providing accessible medical aid to severely ill people with low income. Within its framework, in 16 countries, 63 ophthalmological centers are operating, 84 surgical points, with 821 Cuban specialists working in them. To date, in Latin American countries, more than 2 million people have already been operated on under this program. Another DA program, I Can Be directed at the elimination of illiteracy in 18 Latin American countries. With its help, more than 5 million people have learned to read and write. Today, the project operates in 19 countries, with more than 690 specialists involved. Thanks to the Yes, I Can program, Venezuela, Bolivia, Nicaragua have been declared territories free from illiteracy. And all this thanks to one person. Agree, it's very interesting to observe in practice what is usually written in school essays about the role of the individual in history. You can talk about the contradictions and contrasts of Cuba for hours, but the episode is not rubber, so we will round off. We hope we surprised you with some facts about Fidel Castro. Rate the episode if it was interesting. And see you in future episodes on our channel.